What's up, college football fans, quarterback fans? Welcome to another Beast Light video episode, YouTube podcast, whatever it is that you call this, wherever you are getting this information. We thank you for tuning in. Sincerely, anyone that watches this or listens to it, it does mean a lot to us. This is the place we talk all things quarterback. This is the Quarterback Hub. And today, super special guest. Anyone that's been following this show from the very beginning or has followed us on social media will know this familiar face and this familiar name, and that is Horns 247 reporter, 247 Sports, Eric Henry, who helped start the show many years ago, and now has moved on to many better and bigger things. But Eric, sincerely, like whenever we first met, for those that don't know, I met Eric several years ago, and he was just starting out at FIU. Did a great job covering FIU. He made me an FIU fan because he was doing such great work. We are the quarterback show, and now he is up with Horns 247, doing a great job. And now I'm excited to welcome him back down to my neck of the woods, and I used to be up his neck of the woods out in Florida. But Eric, man, I'm pumped to have you on. Pumped to talk some Texas football and some other things. But man, I'm pumped to have you experience the Texas heat and what it really is all about. I know you mentioned it when you were down here the other day, but there's nothing really quite like this. Can you tell people like why you're wearing a cutoff shirt? Because it's just so hot outside.
Well, okay, to be fair, I am still in Florida right now. I'm making the move from Florida over to Texas. And listen, Florida itself is very hot. It is hot. But I don't remember if I texted you this, Steve, or not, because I know I've said this to some people. I thought I knew heat. Yeah. Texas heat blows Florida heat out of the water. And I don't know if it's because me being where I'm at in Tampa, and you know this, Steve, when I met you talked about, we started this podcast together, and you've brought it to bigger and better heights. You know, you've got better co-hosts and you know, doing big, better things, you know, great guests, huge fan of what you've done. So it's just funny for all of the listeners here. When Steve started this, you know, we started this, Steve could barely put together a podcast, and now he's just a maven doing his own thing. You know, he's getting great guests, and the production value is great. So I love everything that Steve is doing. But you talk about the fact that when we met in Florida a few years back, yeah, man, I don't know if it's because of the fact that we're here in Tampa by the water, and you know, kind of get that breeze off the Gulf, and it cools off a little bit. But when I was in Texas, you know, kind of doing some apartment hunting and getting familiarized with Austin. That heat, man, it is wild. It is legit. Yeah. So every time I have been to Texas, really in the past 6 months, whether it's been Dallas or Austin or wherever, there's something about that heat, man. And Steve, you got to help me know, because you're a native Texan, right?
Yep.
It's not that Texas doesn't have humidity, because Texas has humidity. It's not as humid as Florida, but Texas heat also isn't that dry heat, right? It's also not that Arizona, Vegas heat, because I can take that all day. But there's just something about Texas that just feels like you're just burning up, man. I don't think that you guys don't have any cloud cover. That's what I think it is. It's like sun beaming down on you.
Like Houston, we always talk about weather. I remember we did this podcast years ago. We'd open up about weather, but in Houston, Austin heat, the Central Texas heat is like an oven. That's the best way to describe it. You're just getting baked like an oven. Before me and Eric turn this to a weatherman show, Eric, is it true that you, as a media member, you can bench the most out of any media members? Is that true? Or is that just a rumor? I don't want to tell the story of you busting out of your pants. Eric's got to be the most jacked media member I've ever came across. Eric did play college football too. So for those that are new to him at Horns 247, that's another cool thing about his reporting too, is it a football perspective, which is always neat. But he still has the package that he used to play.
Well, I first off, I appreciate that, Stephen, and the checks in the mail. I did not pay you to mention any of that. The reason I am in a cutoff shirt is because Steve, for the audience, to bring you guys behind the curtain here, Steve, we're supposed to tape this at 3 my time, and Steve said, "Hey, I'm still finishing. I'm working out. You know, I got to finish my workout." So I also was in the gym, and I'm just running straight from the gym here. So that's the purpose of the cutoff shirt. That's all it is, right? Steve's a married man. You know, he keeps the package, you know, to himself. You know, that's the reason why for that. As far as being the most, strongest media member, I don't necessarily know if that's something to boast about, because that's like, being like the strongest 8th grader who failed, 8th grade a couple times. You know what I mean? But I appreciate the compliment. Yes, I played a year of NAIA football, so maybe it's the only skill I have left. It's funny, Steve. We had on our previous podcast when I was working with SB Nation, we had Charles Huff on, Marshall head coach Charles Huff, and we're kind of chopping up talking about, athleticism and whatnot. And, we were joking about Coach Huff, him beginning his career as a fullback and then slowly shifting his way into being on the line at the center, right? And he said, you just keep eating and eating and eating, and then that's where they put you. And it was a joke saying, "Oh, Eric, you have a couple snaps left." And I said, "Yeah, I too was a fullback, and someone who kind of just kept eating and eating. But in order to play for Coach Huff, I'm lacking one major thing. That's talent, and that's the reason why my talent now is just in the gym. Anything football related, I'll leave that to the young kids. It's just lifting weights. So
hey,
I'm available to help move. That's about it.
You and me both, bro. You and me both. And speaking of football, speaking of Texas football, now you've been around the program a little bit. I'm super excited to dive in, just have a deep dive, just a deep quarterback conversation, right? I want to talk about kind of just your thoughts and just the time you've been able to cover the team and dive in, but then I'll talk about like the steps that the quarterbacks have to take in that room. So I just say we just dive in each one kind of individually, just kind of the top 3-4 guys, and just kind of give the fans like a little deep dive in the Texas quarterback room, and then we'll touch on some other stuff as well. But let's go ahead and start with Quinn Ewers. And there's a few things, at least in my opinion, I think that he needs to do to take the next step. He crashes last year. He's an uber talented guy. That goes without say. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to know that. But in your coverage and the film you've been able to watch and what you've been able to dive into, what have been just your big takeaways right off the bat? Like, what has this stood out right out the bat as you've been covering the team thus far?
Yeah, well, also, to be clear, I've been covering the team now. It is July. I've been covering the team since May. So I haven't seen Quinn Ewers throw live or anything like that. But just in watching old game film and things like that, I mean, you see all the physical tools, right? And that's what made him such a highly touted recruit coming out of high school. I think the big thing, Steve, in my mind, is inexperience, and then with talking with some people who've covered the program, much longer than I have, and people who covered Quinn last year, his inexperience showed, because of course he hasn't played a lot of football since his junior year of high school entering last year. And I think that was the big thing, is that, with the inexperience, getting his feet wet, of course, getting knocked out against Alabama, missing a few games. It's just really about getting those reps. I mean, I kind of wish Brady McBride were here, on the podcast. He could speak to this. It's all about getting reps. And it's like anything, right? The more you do it, the better you'll get at it, ideally, or at least the more experience, more natural those things will come. So for Quinn, it's not a matter of, in my mind, from what I've seen, a guy who doesn't have it, physically speaking. I think when you play at his level and you're as highly touted as he is, you have all the physical, capabilities and attributes to be a top-notch quarterback. It's just a matter of going out there, getting comfortable in Coach Steve Sarkisian's system and doing it over and over and over. And here's the big thing, Steve, in my mind. He's got all the weapons this year, right? For any quarterback who plays for Texas this year, they've got all the weapons. You have Xavier Worthy. You got Jatavian Sanders from Denton Ryan High School, a big tight end at 6'4", 250. You've got A.D. Mitchell, Jordan Whittington. I mean, A.D. Mitchell's a guy who came from Georgia, and even though he didn't play a ton, if you look at his, I think he's got 6 or 7 career touchdown receptions, and 5 of them are in college football playoff games. So he's someone who, when the stage has been the biggest and the lights are the brightest, he's made plays. So you got the talent there. You got, DeAndre Moore and Jonte Cook, who are 5-star recruits at wide receiver, have come in. So the wide receiver room was deep. Isaiah Naylor is someone I didn't even mention, who was a transfer from Wyoming, caught 12 touchdowns, a big-bodied receiver, probably the biggest of the group at 6'3", 210 pounds. So I just rattled off 5 receivers and a tight end right there. It's not even talking about the running game. They signed the nation's number 1 recruit in C.J. Baxter from Central Florida, or not from UCF Central Florida, from Central Florida area, I should say, Edgewater High School in Orlando. So a ton of talent. It's just going to be a matter of getting that experience, and the playmakers are surrounding Quinn Ewers and really all the quarterbacks. But yeah, to answer your question, in my mind, I think it's just a matter of getting those game reps and him really kind of feeling that the offense is his own in year 2 in this system.
Yeah, I think you nailed it, and I think most Texas fans probably know this, the junkies, but he was hurt in high school some too, so it wasn't like he just had a ton of experience after experience. Even his junior year, went to state, he was hurt some, came back and played. I think he played hurt some of those games, or at least wasn't a fully 100%. And so then you miss a year, go to Ohio State. And so I think you nailed it. Even when he was in high school, though, there was still that experience that he wasn't able to completely. And then you're right with the talent that they have. Second year in the system, and even like last year, like he was banged up playing, right? Like you saw the flashes, like the quarter Alabama, of course, Oklahoma, the bowl game he did well. But even the games he struggled in, Oklahoma State, TCU, even games he struggled in, I think, as most quarterbacks do, they get majority blame, even if it's not their fault. If you go back and watch the film, there's several drops out there. We don't know if a receiver's running a wrong route. We don't know what the read is. So I think even though there were times he struggled, of course, I still think it was a much better season than maybe the outside looking in would kind of grade that. So I think there's the stuff to build on. And I think you're right that with that experience, it should, transfer over. They're going to find it pretty soon in week 2, right? Is it week 2 they go to Alabama? Is that right?
Correct.
Yeah, they're going to find.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So that's a game that everyone has circled. And so I think I will not be surprised if Texas comes out on top of that one. I'm making any predictions, not what we do, but with the talent you mentioned and with a quarterback like Quinn Ewers, if he takes that next step, how, people are thinking he's going to, then that could, be a high possibility. What would you say with Quinn Ewers? What would be, from maybe the non-Texans fans that are watching this, what makes him so talented besides just like a big arm? What's something that like that jumps off on the screen where like, man, like he's a special quarterback because of X, Y, and Z, or because he fits the system well? Like what is one thing that isn't as obvious to people that makes him such a talented quarterback?
In my mind, and it's almost how do I want to say this, Steve? With quarterbacks in today's day and age, I think you might be, someone who can speak this as well, right? High school recruits, big time high school recruits from 10, 15 years ago, right? They didn't have as much quarterback training. Yes, they played high school football, played a ton, but they didn't have as much quarterback training and that specialized training. So what I'm going to say is something that's in my mind, a strong suit of Quinn Ewers, but I also think it's a reflection of maybe you could talk about a lot of 5-star quarterbacks coming out over the past 4 or 5 years who have this, is just the maturity and kind of the owning of the position. Quarterbacks are coming into college more and more mature. And I don't mean mature as in emotional maturity or, they're still 18, 19 years old, but it's like they've been playing quarterback their whole life in that sense, right? In the sense of coming in, being ahead of the game, ahead of the curve as far as learning a college system, a college offense. So in my mind, I think that's a really strong suit of Quinn Ewers that maybe, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, my time covering group of 5 players, group of 5 teams. If you're a high level, someone who's gone through the elite 11s and the 7-on-7s and all of those things, right? You come in as such a more mature, developed, well-rounded quarterback as maybe some of the kids at the group of 5 level who, for one reason or another, it's not that they're not as talented or less talented per se, but if you're a 2-star kid or a 3-star kid, you might not have gone to 7-on-7s from the time you're in 8th grade or been elite 11 and things of that nature. So I just think it's that overall knowledge and maturity and growth in the position as far as being a quarterback that I think suits him. But, I could say the same thing probably about a Dylan Raiola, who's coming in as the number 1 quarterback in the nation coming in next year, who's committed to Georgia, or an Aaron Noland, or, a lot of these kids, Arch Manning. Well, I mean, Arch Manning is a football family, so maybe that's not a great example, but you get what I'm saying as far as quarterbacks as being so much more developed as far as their well-roundedness in the position now versus maybe even 5-10 years ago.
Yeah, no, I think that's spot on. I think, when you mention well-developed and physically developed, if you go look at that picture, I'm sure you saw it of all the quarterbacks flexing for Texas and talk about, or speaking about being physically developed, Malik Murphy, who if you talk to a lot of Texas fans are really high on coming up that spring game. There are rumors of other schools trying to get him, and whatever was happening, who the hell really knows. But regardless, there's a lot of buzz around him, right? And so, super talented guy from California, right? Again, he's able to learn the offense. He's able to kind of get some experience and strong arm, big talented athlete. That's obvious, but have you been able to dive into much high school film of him yet, or have you been able to kind of chew on kind of, why so many schools were around Murphy, after the spring game, besides playing well? Like what was your take on that whole situation?
I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of his spring game. For anyone who has not seen Texas's spring game, Malik Murphy threw back-to-back dimes. He threw a touchdown pass. I believe the touchdown pass was to Jonte Cook. I'm going to have to go back and fact check this. And if I get it wrong, I'll fact check it when you drop this episode. But it was the 2 freshman receivers who I mentioned, Jonte Cook and DeAndre Moore. I believe Jonte Cook caught the touchdown pass and DeAndre Moore dropped it. I don't want to assign a drop to a receiver. That's the worst thing you can put on your name, right? It's a drop. But it was a drop TD pass that Malik Murphy threw. And I mean, it was a dime in the air, 55 yards downfield. The next play, short memory, goes back, hits it for a touchdown pass. When you see that type of physical, just talent, right? You talked about him, the picture that, it was circulated recently that he dropped on Twitter, as far as Arch Manning was listed at 6'4", 6'5", 220. Quinn Ewers, who's no small kid. All the quarterbacks are in that quarterback room are big kids. And then Malik Murphy looks like a Megatron. He looks as if 6'6"-ish almost. Just looks ripped to shreds. But in my mind, Steve, you talked about why were maybe so many teams after him. You have to look at college football in today's environment. It doesn't matter whether it's quarterback or really any player. I think you have to look at your spring, right? Whether it's spring practices and then transition that into the spring game as your opportunity, whether it's not like back in the day where you were only impressing your coaches, right? The spring is not like a NFL preseason where, remember back in the day, Steve, when we grew up and watched football and they'd say to guys, those guys came in the third and fourth quarter, not only you're auditioning for your own team, but you're auditioning for the 31 other clubs out there, 30, back in the day, 30 other NFL teams, because you may get picked up on the waiver wire. You may not make it on this team, but there may be, a team that, makes a move and says, hey, we need that guy that we saw play in preseason. That's how the spring is. So I think a lot of teams were looking at Malik Murphy as such a talented kid coming out of high school and saying, all right, what does he have? Is he someone who we could possibly bring in our system and plug and play immediately? The spring game validated that, Steve. We have so many kids, 3, 4, 5-star recruits who for whatever reason don't end up playing immediately. And for coaches to get a chance to see that on film, that just made him such an enticing prospect. But in my mind, I think he made the right decision coming back to Texas. Here's why. I think there's something to be said about going back and, challenging Quinn Ewers, pushing Arch Manning, being pushed by those guys another year in Steve Sarkisian's system. That if for whatever reason, let's say Quinn Ewers balls out and goes to the NFL and does what he needs to do after this year, and for some reason Malik Murphy isn't the starting quarterback, right? Let's say it's Arch Manning entering spring. At least he has another year on that system, and he can speak to the fact that he competed against two of the top quarterbacks, as far as talent quarterbacks in the nation, in one of the top quarterback rooms, and he can carry that in to wherever he may be next year, whether that's Texas or elsewhere, if he chooses to transfer.
Yeah, I think I think it's a win-win situation for Malik Murphy right now, where he's able to learn under a great offensive mind like Sark, able to compete with some of the best quarterbacks in the nation. And the spring game, he showed that he can ball, and he's on a lot of teams' radar, right? So regardless if he ends up being a starting Texas or somewhere else, I think he's in a really good situation right now. And you mentioned Texas being one of the best quarterback rooms in the nation. I think that's right, especially if all these guys pan out. Like, this could be the most talented quarterback room in the nation. I don't think that's too far-fetched to say. Maybe they're not as proven as maybe some others, like an LSU or USC quarterback room. But I think as a whole, like a lot of these guys can start other programs, whether Arch Manning, of course, even like Charles Wright, he's the fourth string, can start different programs. Like he was a good talented quarterback coming out of high school. Do you want to touch at all on Arch Manning at all? I know that that's been covered like crazy, has talked so much about Arch Manning. Like we know, like, what more can we really say, right? Like he's football royalty, top quarterback in the class of 20 whatever this was, about 2023. Right, got my right, and one of the most talented quarterbacks. A lot of stuff. Do you want to touch on Arch Manning at all? Do you want to dive into anything about the situation or anything like that, or do you think it's been just covered, to death these past year or two, essentially?
I mean, I'll give a couple quick thoughts on Arch Manning, and then I think, talk about a tough situation for a kid to walk into. Now, with that being said, again, he's from a football family. He has obviously his famous uncles. I doubt that the scrutiny and the spotlight is too much for him. It's something that he probably dealt with his entire high school career. Of course, going to the high school that, again, I believe both Peyton and Eli went to Isidore Newman High School in New Orleans. I just felt in my mind, for some, again, of those fringe outlets in my mind, what we call those aggregate sites, people who they're not on the ground, they're in Texas, they don't cover the team, they're just Arch Manning and hot takes and clicks. Yep. It's about what you expected from a freshman coming into spring, right? I'm sure no one holds himself to a higher standard than Arch. And did he come in there and set the world on fire in the spring game? No. But with that being said, he's a freshman, so I guess if the expectations go along with the name in my mind, But for just an outsider's perspective, and again, I'll get a chance to, when fall camp breaks, to dive into the team more in depth. But from an outsider's perspective, I thought he did about what you'd expect from a freshman.
Yeah.
I wasn't expecting to come in and win the job immediately from someone who it's just acting like Quinn Ewers and Malik Murphy aren't just as talented as him. That's a misnomer in my mind. It's just the name carries a lot of weight. He's obviously a very talented kid, and we'll see what happens as things play out.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. I'm glad you brought up the spring game. I totally forgot that was a clickbait thing, after the spring game about Arch Manning not playing very well. But if you look back at spring games, you have quarterbacks that go like 15 of 15, have great spring games and when fall comes around on the bench, or quarterbacks that play atrocious in the spring game and they come around and lead the conference in passing. So the spring game is not too much to put a lot of thought into, at least. In his position, his situation. So I'm glad that you brought that up. And before we, transfer to, because I do want to talk some group of 5 football. For those that aren't familiar, we used to just talk group of 5 quarterbacks. So we do want to touch up. But before we dive into that, I want to stay in the Big 12 a little bit, unless there's anything else you want to talk about the Texas quarterback room. I think we both agree they're one of the most talented rooms in the nation, with a lot to a lot of potential, a lot of room to develop. So if you want to touch on any more topics of the quarterbacks in the Texas room, I'll let you go ahead. But if not, I want to dive into the 2 quarterbacks you mentioned off air in the Big 12, and I want you to kind of get it and take those 2 and kind of explain why that why you're kind of excited to see them play, as you are going to be watching more Big 12 football this year.
Yeah, so the 2 guys we talked about off air is Oklahoma's Dylan Gabriel and Kansas' Jalen Daniels. In my mind, those are the 2 guys who, when you talk about top 3, your top runner, your front runners for all conference teams at the end of the year, it's going to be Quinn Ewers, it's going to be Jalen Daniels, it's going to be Dylan Gabriel. Gabriel's the situation where, in my mind, we know what he did at UCF and was a very talented player at that level. Of course, when UCF wasn't then the American, was a standout quarterback, right? Probably the reason why he now is at Oklahoma is because, now UCF head coach Gus Malzahn comes in and they run a different system, right? It's just one that wasn't necessarily catered to what Gus Malzahn's trying to do. Of course, they have John Reese Plumlee, and you need a little bit more athleticism than Dylan Gabriel, who is more of a pocket passer. Not that he's not athletic, but he's looking to throw first, run second. Whereas John Rice Plumlee, is someone who could probably equally fit both dynamics. But you saw what happened last year when he got knocked out of the TCU game with a concussion. The next week, Texas came, and I believe it was the next week, and I know he missed the Texas start, so may have been a bye week in between, but he had a concussion, and things really fell apart for Oklahoma. So him playing an entire, full season, what does he have to offer? In my mind, he probably is someone who these 2 quarterbacks, he and Daniels, have the biggest boom, highest potential, highest ceiling. I wouldn't say they have boom or bust, because I think both of them are going to be fine quarterbacks and have really excellent years. But as far as that ceiling, that high ceiling potential, I'm really interested to see what Dylan Gabriel does. And then with Jalen Daniels, Steve, you can say the same thing. When Kansas got off to that great start, believe they went 5-0 or 5-1, if memory serves me correct, got out to a really hot start. And Jalen Daniels gets hurt. Again, I believe that was against TCU as well, different weeks, of course. And Kansas was forced to turn to Jason Bean. That's a quarterback who we know really well from the Group of 5 level, former North Texas Mean Green quarterback. Jason Bean's a super athlete. I mean, track speed, legit track speed, 6'5", 185 pounds. But they weren't able to have the offensive success consistently, and they dropped 2 out of 3 starts that Jason Bean had. And that results in them having, I believe they finished 6 and 7, if memory serves me correct. They got to that really hot start. So for Kansas and Lance Leipold, who's trying to rebuild that program in year 3, a reason why I have a spotlight on him, on Jalen Daniels, is because in my mind, everything really falls on his shoulders as far as the potential for Kansas this season. If they're going to be a sleeper, they're going to have to go to Texas. They're going to have some really, tough competition. If they're going to be a sleeper to really exceed last year's record, it's really going to fall on his shoulders in my mind. They do have some talent returning as well. Got some solid pieces on the offensive line, but it's going to be a combination of Jalen Daniels and that run game and what can they do as far as where the Jayhawks, if they're going to be a sleeper, maybe, rise up and beat some teams that they shouldn't or aren't projected to entering this year.
Yeah, that's the thing about the Big 12, especially with, U of H and UCF and BYU and Cincy entering this year. It's like you have like tiers essentially, but no tier is so far above the bottom tier like you can lose, right? Like every game could be decided by like a touchdown or less, between every school in the Big 12 for the most part, especially since Kansas has like you mentioned, has projected upward these past 2 years, largely because of Daniels. Dylan Gabriel too. You're right. Like OU was a different team when he was hurt. And even the games that he played that they lost were pretty close games if I remember correctly. So few plays happen or few plays go different, then Gabriel could be thought of the top quarterback heading into the Big 12 next year. You know what I mean? So I think spot on. There's a few of the quarterbacks I like, or at least I'm interested in the Big 12, and that's Chandler Morris from TCU taking over. I'm excited to see that with Browse's offense coming in. Morris is an athletic guy, former Oklahoma backup quarterback. And then, Emory Jones going to Cincinnati. U of H is going to have a new quarterback. They had some transfers come in, one from Tech and one from Arkansas, actually. That'll be interesting. So it's just, the Big 12 is going to be fun. There's like so much parity in the Big 12. Like every week there's a game that's close. Oklahoma has a quarterback from Michigan who started at Texas Tech years ago and then transferred to Michigan, came back to Oklahoma State, Alan Bowman. So I mean, there's just like so much different kind of musical chairs essentially in today's day and age. But there's so much just like storylines and interesting takes and interesting quarterback competitions and quarterbacks in general in the Big 12. But I agree that Daniels and Dylan Gabriel are probably 1 and 2 right behind Quinn Ewers, but super interesting or nonetheless. I do want to dive into some Group of 5 quarterback, but before we do that, I think a good transition, if you don't mind speaking on this a little bit, because you've seen Group of 5, you've seen Power 5. If you wouldn't mind speaking a little bit on maybe some of the differences you've seen, obviously the resources that a Group of 5 compared to Power 5. Power 5, has so many more resources to recruit. So maybe if you can talk about the differences in recruiting, maybe a little bit, just because you've been able to cover that, and then just any differences at all that you've been able to see, maybe like a behind the scenes look. Of course, we know the obvious, the resources, maybe kind of talking in detail on that.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about recruiting between Power 5 level and Group of 5 level. You can't not acknowledge resources, because that is the main difference, right? It's not necessarily that coaches aren't out there, making recruiting pitches or you have a lot of coaches at the Group of 5 level who've coached at the Power 5 level. They're veteran coaches. They're doing their thing as far as being on the recruiting trail. But it's the difference between, and I'll give you this, right? So when I was covering Florida International, FIU head coach Mike McIntyre, we asked him at, I believe it was the December signing day, if memory serves me correct. We asked him, NIL, how often does that come up in conversation with a recruit? And he said every single home he walked into, NIL was a conversation. Every single one. Now, if you got the Power 5 level, you probably have a collective. You have some sort of resource that you can talk about. Now, not all Power 5s are created equally, right? What Kansas has in relation to Texas, or what Vanderbilt has in relation to Alabama and Ole Miss, or Georgia, obviously different, right? But at least you have some sort of foundation that you can speak on. For most Group of 5s, NIL just isn't. It's the fact of the matter of the game is it's not really a thing, right? You have a handful of G5s who have NIL collectives and are trying to get something going, but you just don't. You don't have the. It's not so you don't have the fan base, but you don't have the fan base that is going to have the pockets enough to have both an NIL collective and donate to their athletic department, right? So that stuff makes a difference. And the reason I mentioned NIL and specificity, Steve, when talking about the dichotomy between Power 5 and Group of 5, a lot of the Group of 5 players who are transferring up, quote unquote, up to Power 5 schools, that's part of the game, right? You don't think Power 5 schools are making recruiting pitches and saying, hey, we have NIL money. I'm not going to name players in specificity, but I've heard some of the amounts that Group of 5 players are leaving G5 schools for, right? It's not millions of dollars. It's not hundreds of thousands of dollars. It's tens of thousands of dollars, right? And those are things that if you have a big collective, that's nothing. And for a Group of 5 school that has nothing, well, that makes all the difference, right? So in terms of recruiting, in that sense, it's really the NIL. That is the name of the game in my mind. Now, where that kind of, I do think that'll slow down a bit, Steve. I think, for example, we saw UTSA I don't know the name of the NIL there in San Antonio, but they put together a nice little thing to incentivize a guy like Frank Harris to return. I do think some Group of Fives will to put some things together, but also I think, like anything, it'll slow down, it'll kind of balance itself out, and eventually it won't be as drastic, but you're always going to have that. And then the second aspect I'll mention in terms of recruiting is Group of Five players, Group of Five teams. They may take a player from high school who isn't quite ready, whether physically or whatever it may be. I'll give you an example. I talked with, I shouldn't say we, because you weren't there, but spoke with Western Kentucky head coach Tyson Helton a couple years back. I want to say it's 2 years ago. And Coach Helton mentioned in his program, Western Kentucky is one that's had a lot of players transfer, quote unquote, up to the G5 level, specifically on the offensive line and at wide receiver. And he said, hey, one of the biggest things for me is, I may have to take a kid who physically isn't ready, right? I may take a kid who's 6'3", 245, 250, 260 in the offensive line, and in 2 years, he's 6'3", 6'4", 280, 290, 300 plus, and a Power 5 school is going to take him in. I'm okay with that. He said, I'm fine with that. I look forward to the challenge of reshaping my roster every year. So that's one of the things at the G5 level, whereas a P5 level, they can take a kid who is 6'3", I'll use Texas as an example. They can take a Kelvin Banks Jr. who ends up starting as a true freshman immediately, right? And a kid who, as a true freshman, allows 3 or 4 sacks. He competed against 4 NFL first-round picks in this past year's draft and didn't allow a sack to any of those guys, right? They can take a kid who is ready like that, and then when they need depth, they can go down and reach at the G5 level and pick a few players off, and that's just is what it is. But in terms of recruiting, that's the biggest thing. I'd say outside of that, in terms of, massive differences, I know you said, something outside of resources, but resources is just so glaring.
Yeah.
It even goes to, the way the players are nutrition, right? A lot of G5 teams, they don't have a nutritionist. They don't necessarily they can try to build a nutrition plan, but they don't have a dedicated nutritionist doing this for each player and that for each player. Where at the Power 5 level, that's just standard operating procedure. I know G5 teams that post game are eating, Raisin Canes and come on, I'm Bob Evans and things like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And listen, I'm not above any of those meals. I'm just saying, that's just what the budget affords, as opposed to, a P5 team probably aren't eating that. So it's a lot of little things like that I think make a difference. And if you talk with any Group of 5 player that has transferred up or transferred down in levels, they'll talk about that for sure.
Yeah, no, I think that's super interesting and something that I think, at least if I was in the audience, that I would find interesting. You don't think about the post game meals. You don't think about some of the small stuff, having a nutritionist, right? Also, to your point on coaches, bringing in these kids who aren't developed yet, but knowing they have to develop them. Kids, because we train a bunch of athletes around the area, and a lot of kids who are recruited whether they go FCS or a Group of 5. They're under the mindset too, like, hey, I'm going to go and ball and play well and transfer to a bigger school, right? Not every, and that's not always the best thing to do, of course, but they're in that mindset too of go to the smaller school, play well, get noticed, and then go to a bigger school. Which why wouldn't you, right? And it's kind of coming true. Not to get in a tangent about Group of 5 and Power 5, this is a quarterback podcast, but it's kind of coming to fruition of the Group of 5 almost being a minor league-ish system to the Power 5, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. Not necessarily a bad thing. Group of 5s can still beat Power 5s, but just as a whole, that's kind of what it's coming to with the NIL and the transfer portal. Would you agree with that statement?
Yeah, it's a tough thing to hear. I honestly want to say, minor leagues is tough, right? Because that's essentially like, it's less than. Maybe this is splitting here, Steve. I would use farm system in a way.
That's probably better way. Yeah.
And again, that's because of everything I mentioned in terms of being able to take a kid who might not be physically developed enough to that Power 5 level, and he ends up at that level in 2 years. It is tough. I empathize with all G5 teams, G5 programs, G5 coaches, because I understand, they're trying to win games like everyone else. And maybe, 10, 15 years ago, you'd be able to bring back your entire roster. You wouldn't have to flip it every 2 years. But now that's just kind of the name of the game. And I could also understand, I had a coach say to me, really talk about the difference between college basketball and college football, right? And that, in college basketball, you still get those mid-majors. You still have a Florida Atlantic that goes on a magical run, right? But that's because the roster is only 12.
Yeah.
So, you're going to play immediately, right? And you can, who knows, if you jump up and you go from FAU to Duke, you're just another guy at Duke, right? And that still happens in football. But if you're at FAU and you're the guy and there's only 5 guys and you're getting your shots, it's a little more glamorous than the football analogy.
Yeah, man. No, we could probably talk about that topic forever. You're right. Like the Power 5 goes gets the G5. The G5 goes gets the FCS. It kind of is just like you mentioned that farm system approach. But I know I'll always like watching the Group of 5. I know you like watching Group of 5. Kind of have as a special place in our heart. Just love root for those kids too that are just as a lot of times just as talented, but for whatever reason got overlooked. That's especially true in the quarterback position. If you take out some freaky traits like arm talent and speed, a lot of the guys that ball at the Group of 5 could probably ball at the Power 5 level, put in that system. It's just that opportunity. I had a quarterback trainer on, Sean Rutherford, like a week or two ago. He kind of mentioned that that's the biggest thing. It's not necessarily the big talent gap besides like your 5 and top 4 stars. It's just the opportunity, the offensive system, and the coaching side of things, which is good. I think all of us to remember, and good for any quarterback recruits watching this who maybe haven't been recruited like you wanted to yet, or maybe aren't where you want to be yet. Like the different opportunities, different seasons come in life, right? So with that said, we're a big Group of 5 fans. Eric, I'm putting you on the spot. Hopefully you're still deep diving in the Group of 5 quarterbacks. I need your top 5 Group of 5 quarterbacks going into this next season. And if you don't mention the same 5 that I put out in a video a month or 2 ago, then I'll know you didn't watch it, and that'll break my heart. So let's see what you got.
Well, forgive me, Steve. I've been a little busy over the past month or so trying to get caught up to a beat. So I may not, and I knew you were going to ask me this question. So in no particular order, I'm sure I'm probably going to leave someone out, but you got to go Michael Pratt. You got to go Austin Reed.
Yes.
Now this is where it gets tricky for me.
You're missing the most obvious one.
Am I?
Coastal Carolina.
Oh, Grayson's back for 100th year. Okay, Grayson McCall. No, you have to go Grayson McCall, of course.
Yeah.
That is more me forgetting that Grayson McCall is back.
I agree.
I've covered Coastal's last 2 bowl games, if memory serves me correct. I can't remember if it's Coastal Liberty, but I did cover. I've covered Coastal's last 2 bowl games. Yeah, so I have seen, and Grayson McCall is a heck of a talent. So definitely would put those 3 guys in there. For me, I'm willing to put Hank Bachmeier in the conversation. Hank Bachmeier, being at Louisiana Tech,
talent-wise, you
may not necessarily have the production, even though I think he was a great, highly productive quarterback at Boise State. I'm sure I'm probably missing someone from the MAC or the Mountain West.
You're missing one that you're going to kick yourself. You mentioned him earlier. You mentioned him like a few minutes ago. You were talking about a potential collective that the school was building.
Oh, well, Frank Harris.
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
You gotta have Frank. Yeah, you gotta have Frank Harris.
Frank Harris
too.
Yeah, so I think that's a good list. The only one would be Carter Bradley for South Alabama. He balled out last year, and then what's the first? Rourke for Ohio from the MAC. Those are probably going to be
Curtis. Is it Curtis?
Curtis. Yep.
Yeah.
Right, it was Curtis, right? What was his brother's name? Do you remember?
Nathan. I think his brother was Nathan. Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. But yeah, no, I think spot on. There's some really cool quarterback competitions going on in the Group of 5 as well. I should make a video on that. But Eric, man, thanks so much for hopping on. That was fun, like old times. Let everyone know where they can find you. They can keep up with your work. If you're not a Texas fan, you should be a Texas fan just so you can keep up with Eric's work.
Sure. Well, you can find me on Twitter at EricCHenry_, and find my Texas coverage. Please follow us. Horns 24/7 Sports.
Definitely up with him. Eric, if you don't mind, I didn't tell you I was going to ask you this before, so I'll give you a minute to think about this. It just came to me. I always, because most of the time we have either quarterbacks on or quarterback coaches on, and so you're our first media member on, which we're pumped about. But I ask every coach or quarterback coach what advice they would give to younger quarterbacks, high school quarterbacks getting recruited coming up. But I want to ask you, what advice would you give to a media member potentially that was in your shoes a few years ago? Yeah, or just someone who wants to continue. Yeah, does that kind of make sense? Maybe someone just getting started off, just graduating college. I'm not a media person, but just some watch your show and they'll be inspired by you and what you've done. So if you wouldn't mind just giving your 2 cents of advice for those guys or girls who are starting off.
Listen, there are people who have done this much longer than me. I graduated grad school in 2017. But if I were giving, and let's just say this is sports, because obviously media, encompasses many things. Let's say you're an aspiring sports reporter, sports, beat writer, whatever. Number one is know your beat. I can't emphasize that enough. What earns you respect from your peers, people, whether it's, podcasters or radio hosts or and really mainly, I'd say primarily coaches and athletes is know your beat, right? Like I can't emphasize that enough. When I say know your beat, I'm not talking about, show up to practice, know a handful of things. I'm talking about know the roster, first string, second string, third string, know something about the guys, especially, where I was at the group of 5 level. Not every group of 5 team gives you a ton of access, but, Florida International towards the end, Mike McIntyre's staff did give us a fair amount of access. And players know this. I don't care what level it is, or coaches know this. When you know what high school they went to, what city they're from, a little bit of background about them, those things make the difference between you just showing up and asking questions, which may not be the best questions, or truly asking smart questions. So that I'll transition that into part 2. If you know your beat, you can ask smart questions. Coaches will respect, the relationship between media and coaches is always tricky. But I'll say this, I covered Butch Davis's last year at FIU. You can hit your Google search and figure out some of the challenges that went on there. That was not the most pleasant year. They went 1-11, and it was, a cluster as far as a lot of things that went on. But I like to think that I did ask Coach Davis some challenging questions. I remember asking him, if he thought his final the final home game would be his final senior night as a head coach. I had to ask him about some things some comments that he made and some choices that he made toward the end that were peculiar to say the least. And right after I covered the last game at Southern Miss, I this, Steve, I drove from Mississippi. I drove to Mississippi and back from Florida because, it was gonna be a little challenge to get there via flight. And I get back home around 5 a.m. I decide I'm going to crash and get a couple hours sleep. And I wake up to a text from Butch Davis saying, hey, I appreciate, you covering the team. You always did it respectfully. And that's, you can't ask to be friends with anybody. That's not the objective of media, but it's just to be mutual respect is the most you can ask for. So I would say that. A couple of things in my mind, Steve, cover something other than sports at some point in time. I don't know if you're talking about like a college kid or whatnot, or a high school kid. I only say that because for me, I started my career in grad school covering public affairs, state politics, things of that nature. And when you deal with real life situations and real life people, it makes it a little bit easier. It gives you a little bit of perspective when you cover a sport. That's not to say that football isn't important, right? If I'm asking Steve Sarkisian a question about something, this is his livelihood. This is his job. It is very important. However, as a reporter, it gives me a little bit of perspective when I've spoken with people who've lost loved ones or, have dealt with personal tragedies, right? It puts it in perspective when you're asking that question about a third down play. So, yeah, those are the 2 things I would say. Know your beat. Also a third thing, this is the last one I'll say. In today's day and age with Zoom and, some of the technological ways you can do things, those things are great, but show your face, right? I don't think there are very few things in my mind I think will earn you as much respect as showing up and a coach or a player can put a face to what that thing that someone wrote, right? I talked about some of those aggregate sites writing things about Arch Manning. People in today's day and age with media, you can kind of get all lumped in because that person who's writing that thing about that aggregate site that's writing that thing about Texas, they're not there on the ground at practice on Tuesday or presser on Monday, right? And you never want to be that guy who takes shots from behind his keyboard or behind his or her keyboard or their keyboard or from their phone. Show up, show your face, and if there's an availability, go. I don't care what it is. They may send out the audio or the Zoom via email or whatnot, but go, show your face. You got to grind and really find success in this role. So those would be three things I would say just off the top of my head. I wasn't prepared for that, so hopefully I gave.
I know. No, that was great. That was a great, thoughtful, several-minute answer. That was awesome. I hope that some people can take that and run with it, man. Well, thank you so much, Eric, for coming on again. Eric Henry, Horns 247 from 247 Sports. Check out his work. Does a great job. We thank you for coming on and talking Texas football. I'm sure this won't be the last time that you come on the show again and talk some Texas quarterbacks. But everyone that watched, thank you for watching. Please subscribe, like all that YouTube jargon. I don't know what the rest they say, but just like the video and all that stuff. It helps us, and we'll see y'all next time. Peace.